Welcome to Should Behaviorism Shape Educational Practices? Part 1, presented by Carolyn Ritter. Let's begin with our table of contents. In the Part 1 video, we'll begin with the lesson activator, followed by a review of our key questions, background information on the Behaviorism School of Psychology, background information on B.F. Skinner, then an examination of the pro side of the argument. Yes, behaviorism should shape educational practices. We would then like you to open the Part 2 video, which will begin with background information on the Humanism School of Psychology, background information on Carl Rogers, followed by an examination of the con side of the argument. No, behaviorism should not shape educational practices. Wrapping things up with a quick viewing of our narrative bibliography and our reflection activity. So let's begin. In the lower half of your screen, you'll see 3 warm-up questions. We would like you to answer the following questions to the best of your ability and post your responses by replying to the discussion thread, Should Behaviorism Shape Educational Practices, on Plato. We certainly would welcome you to post all 3 responses on one thread. Once you've posted, please take the time to read and reflect on your classmates' posts as well. The 3 questions we'd like you to respond to are as follows. Is free will obtainable for humans, or is it just an illusion? What is more important in the shaping of the individual? The natural traits they inherit, or the environment they are raised in? How do you use positive and/or negative reinforcements in your classroom? Give us an example. Please take a moment now to pause the video and go to the Plato website to post your responses. Welcome back. Let's take a look at our key questions for today's lesson. First off, can all student behavior be explained without consideration to their internal mental states or consciousness? Is student learning essentially the acquisition of new behavior based on environmental conditions? And finally, can we, as educators, bridge the ideological gap and build a more constructive educational atmosphere? Lots to think about. So let's begin with a look at behaviorism. According to Psychology Today, behaviorism seeks to identify observable, measurable laws that could explain all of human behavior. Although psychology now pays more attention to the inner landscape of emotions and thought, behaviorism has had a durable influence on everything from animal training to parenting techniques to the bonuses financial managers receive. And this says a lot about behaviorism in education as well, as I believe you'll all find that what is old is new again. Behaviorism focuses on observable, measurable behaviors, and then looks at the importance of the role that environment plays on determining those behaviors. Behaviorism is one of the largest schools of psychology and is very important in at least the study of the history of it because of the contribution the School of Behaviorism plays to making psychology accepted as a legitimate science. Up until the 20th century, psychology had been relegated to pseudoscience. Behaviorism, or the ideas that influence behaviorism, were first introduced by the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1904 for his dog conditioning experiment. Although the goal of the experiment wasn't the dog conditioning. More about that later on. Behaviorism, as a full-fledged separate school of psychology, really originates with the American psychologist John B. Watson. He begins his work around the end of World War I, and behaviorism as a school of psychology is seen as a reaction to the introspective psychologies of structuralism that were very popular at the turn of the 20th century. The goal of behaviorism was to align psychology with the objective experimental processes that were classic to the accepted schools of science like chemistry and physics. For example, the use of the scientific method to gather empirical evidence was a classic component of chemistry and physics and biology. And behaviorism sought to apply that use to psychology in order for it to become an accepted, legitimate science. Even the alternative schools of psychology that were becoming popular at the same time period, that would include psychoanalysis with its father, Sigmund Freud. I'm sure you're all familiar with him. These alternative schools even recognized the value of the objective validation of their experiential hypotheses. And that's really what behaviorism was promoting. B.F. Skinner goes a step further and builds on the work established by the American psychologist John B. Watson. In fact, he starts to shape the school of behaviorism to focus on the task of psychology. And that, of course, was to predict and control behavior, no longer concerned with the sort of inner workings of the mind. This leads us to two schools developing within the school of behaviorism. First off, we have the development of the classical behaviorism, popular from approximately 1912 to approximately 1930. The goal of classical behaviorism was to understand psychology through stimulus and response, the relationship between these two. Eventually, this understanding evolved into the belief that every response would be triggered by a specific stimulus. These ideas were popularized first by the works of Ivan Pavlov and then built on by the works of John B. Watson. In the 1930s, throughout the 40s and 50s and into 1960, we see the evolution of behaviorism into the school of neo-behaviorism. And the goal of neo-behaviorism was to adopt the general methodology that had been established by the classical behaviorism of Watson, to create an experiment-based theory on adaptive human behavior. And of course, because neo-behaviorism was interested in adaptive human behaviors, it tended to be dominated by learning theorists, such as Clark L. Hull and B.F. Skinner. We're going to talk about more a little later. And this brings us to classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. We're going to ask you to take a moment to view this short video. It's entitled How to Train a Brain. It was created by Crash Course Psychology. This is episode 11, a great resource. The video is vocabulary rich, and it's a fairly concise overview of the basics of behaviorism that we have just outlined.
So the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell. It's because his experiments are among the most famous in the history of psychology. His work contributed to the foundation of the behaviorist school of thought that viewed psychology as an empirically rigorous science focused on observable behaviors and not unobservable internal mental processes. Even though today we view psychology as the science of both behavior and mental processes, Pavlov's influence was tremendous. His research helped pave the path for more experimental rigor in behavioral research, right up to the present day. Born in 1849 in Russia, Pavlov was never much for psychology. After giving up on his original aspirations to become a Russian Orthodox priest like his father, he instead earned a medical degree and spent nearly 20 years studying the digestive system, earning Russia's first Nobel Prize in his mid-50s for his research expanding our understanding of how stomachs worked. He didn't study human stomachs, though, because the procedures were terrible and cruel. He studied dog stomachs, and while researching those dogs, he noticed how the animals would salivate at a mere whiff of their dinner. At first, he found all that slobber annoying, but soon started to suspect that this behavior was actually a simple but important form of learning. For us scholars of psychology, we can define learning as the process of acquiring, through experience, new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Whether through association, observation, or just plain thinking, learning is what allows us to adapt to our environments and to survive. And as Pavlov began to discover, it wasn't only humans who learned. Soon enough, he was turning out his famous series of experiments in which he paired the presence of meat powder, yummy, which got the dogs to drooling, with lots of different neutral stimuli, things that wouldn't normally make you drool, like a certain sound or shining a light or a touch on the leg. Then Pavlov observed after several of these pairings, a dog would start to drool just at the sound or the light or the touch, even if there wasn't any slobber-inducing meat powder around. Animals, he found, can exhibit associative learning. That's when a subject links certain events, behaviors, or stimuli together in the process of conditioning. This may be the most elemental, basic form of learning a brain can do, but that doesn't mean that the processes behind conditioning are or ever were obvious, or for that matter, simple. In fact, the research that's gone into how we're conditioned by our environments has helped shape the science of psychology from a still kind of subjective thought exercise into the more rigorous discipline we know today. And it starred some of psychology's most notable and often controversial figures, including Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, and that guy who trained kids to be terrified of furry animals. Okay, I'm not a licensed dog trainer. Do they license dog trainers? But I can break down for you the sequence of steps in Pavlov's famous experiment to help you get a sense of how conditioning works. First, before conditioning, the dog just drools when it smells food. That smell is the unconditioned stimulus, and the slobbering, the unconditioned or natural response. The ringing sound, which at this point means nothing to the dog, is the neutral stimulus, and it produces no drooling. During conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, the food smell, is paired with the neutral stimulus, the bell sound, and results in drooling. This is repeated many times until the association between the two stimuli is made in a stage called acquisition. By the time you get to the after conditioning phase, that old neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, because it now elicits the conditioned response of drooling. Sounds super simple, right? If you have a dog, you've probably seen it tap dance at the side of a leash, but in Pavlov's day, this whole series of steps hadn't really been studied in a lab setting or even thought about in scientific terms. Pavlov's work suggested that classical conditioning, as this kind of learning came to be known, could be an adaptive form of learning that helps an animal survive by changing its behavior to better suit its environment. In this case, a bell means food, and food means survival, so get ready. Not only that, but methodologically, classical conditioning shows how a process like learning can actually be studied through direct observation of behavior in real time without all those messy feelings and emotions. This is something Pavlov especially appreciated given his disdain for mentalistic concepts like consciousness and introspection championed by Freud. Behaviorist psychologists like Pavlov's younger American analogs B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson also embraced the notion that psychology was all about objective, observable behavior. In his 1930 book Behaviorism, he argued that given a dozen healthy infants, he could train any one of them to be a doctor, artist, lawyer, or even a thief, regardless of their talents, tendencies, or ancestry. Oh there, Watson! Thankfully, no one gave him any infants. In his most famous, and yes, controversial experiment, Watson conditioned a young child dubbed Little Albert to fear a white rat. Maybe that doesn't sound so bad, but he accomplished this by pairing the rat with a loud, scary noise over and over, and then demonstrated that the terror could branch out and be generalized to include other furry white objects like bunnies, dogs, or even fur coats. So yeah, that would not fly today, obviously, but Watson's research did make other psychologists wonder whether adults, too, were just holding tanks of conditioned emotions, and if so, whether new conditioning could be used to undo old conditioning. Like, if you're terrified of roller coasters, but you made yourself ride one 10 times a day for 2 weeks, would your fears fade? For the record, recent exploration has revealed that the boy known as Little Albert sadly died a few years after these experiments, while Watson eventually left academia and got into advertising, where he put all that associative learning to lucrative use. So that's classical conditioning. But we've also got another kind of associative learning, operant conditioning. If classical conditioning is all about forming associations between stimuli, operant conditioning involves associating our own behavior with consequences. The kid who gets a cookie for saying please, or the aquarium seal that gets a sardine for balancing a ball on its nose, they've both been trained with operant conditioning. The basic premise here is that behaviors increase when followed by reinforcement or reward, but they decrease when followed by punishment. And the most well-known champion of operant conditioning is American behaviorist B.F. Skinner. He designed the famous operant chamber, or Skinner box, a confined space containing a lever or button that an animal could touch to get some kind of reward, typically food, along with a device that keeps track of its responses. Okay, time for a debunking break. Other than maybe Freud, no other figure in psychology seems to be as shrouded in lore and misinformation as B.F. Skinner. So I'm just going to tell you straight that no, Skinner never put any kids in the box. And no, he didn't raise his children without love or affection, and his daughter didn't hate his guts until the day she committed suicide. Deborah Skinner is alive and well, and she loved her dad plenty. Skinner did, however, invent something called an air crib, a climate-controlled box with a window on the front that was meant to keep babies warm and safe while their moms ran around doing their 1950s lady thing. It's not exactly where I'd like to spend the night, but it wasn't remotely the same as the Skinner box. No one knows where all these myths came from, but being a somewhat controversial guy, Skinner had a lot of haters, some of whom were probably happy to perpetuate misinformation. But back to the rat in the box. Basically, the box provided an observable stage to demonstrate Skinner's concept of reinforcement, which is anything that increases the behavior that it follows. In other words, you push the lever, you get a snack, and then you want to keep pushing the lever. But most rats aren't gonna push a lever for no reason. I mean, there aren't food dispensing levers in the natural environment, so operant conditioning behavior requires shaping. Maybe you give the rat a little nibble of food each time it gets closer to the bar, then only when it touches the bar, until little by little, in a series of successive approximations to the desired behavior, you reward them only when they do the thing you're trying to shape them to do. In everyday life, we're all continually reinforcing, shaping, and refining each other's behaviors, both intentionally and accidentally. We do this with both positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement obviously strengthens responses by giving rewards after a desired event, like the rat snack after the lever push, or getting a cookie when you say please. Negative reinforcement is a little trickier. It's what increases a behavior by taking away an aversive or upsetting stimulus. Like, say, you get in your car, and it does that infernal beeping thing until you fasten your seatbelt. The car is reinforcing your seatbelt wearing by getting rid of that horrible beeping. And it's good, because you should wear your seatbelt. It's important to recognize here that negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. Punishment decreases a behavior either positively, by, say, getting a speeding ticket, or negatively, by taking away a driver's license. But negative reinforcement removes the punishing event to increase the behavior. So painkillers negatively reinforce the behavior of swallowing them by ending the headache. So by now, hopefully you're getting the picture. There are things that we want and things that we don't want, and we can be taught by way of those impulses to behave certain ways. But it's worth pointing out that conditioning is way more complex than just the cookie in the beeping car. For one thing, ending annoyance or getting a cookie are types of primary reinforcers. You don't have to learn that. They just make innate biological sense. Beeping is annoying, cookies are delicious. But there are other kinds of reinforcers that we only recognize after we learn to associate them with primary reinforcers. Like a paycheck is a conditioned reinforcer. We want money because we need food and shelter, which are still the primary drivers. Plus, just as there are different kinds of reinforcers, so are there various reinforcement schedules. Like those boxed rats were getting continuous reinforcement when they got a treat every single time they hit the lever, so they picked it up pretty quickly. But if one day the rat chow doesn't come, that connection quickly dwindles and the rat stops hitting the lever. This is a process called extinction, and it is important because that's how real life works. Outside of a Skinner box, you're not going to get continuous reinforcement. All of life is a series of partial or intermittent reinforcements that only occur sometimes. Learning under these conditions takes longer, but it holds up better in the long run and is less susceptible to that extinction. So say a cafe gives out a free cup of coffee for every 10 you buy, while another shop pours a free double shot every Tuesday morning, and yet another has a free coffee lottery lottery that customers win at random. These are all different kinds of intermittent reinforcement techniques that get customers coming back for more. Now, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner's ideas were definitely controversial, as well as the whole scary rat experiments. Plenty of folks disagreed with their insistence that only external influences and not internal thoughts and feelings shaped behavior. It was clear to many of the behaviorists' rivals that our cognitive processes, our thoughts, perceptions, feelings, memories, also influence the way we learn. We're going to talk about how these other things factor into learning next week when we look more at conditioning, cognition, and observational learning. And yeah, also watch kids beat the face off blow-up dolls. Today, though, you learned how associative learning works, the essentials of behaviorist theory, the basic components of classical and operant conditioning, including positive and negative reinforcement and reinforcement scheduling. Thanks for watching this, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course or get a special laptop decal, or even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to Subbable.com. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor is Michael Ronda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
In 1944, Skinner began work on a missile target system using pigeons to peck at targets. Now, in 1944, we were at the height of World War II, and bomb locations, bomb targeting, was at a premium for the U.S. government. Unfortunately, Skinner's project, later referred to as Project Pigeon, was discontinued due to the development of radar. However, Skinner's Project Pigeon wasn't a complete waste of time. Skinner discovered that pigeons behave faster than rats, and this epiphany opened new possibilities for Skinner's research, including the development of technology. One of these technological developments, Skinner called his baby tender. Skinner's wife was pregnant with their second child, and at her request, he designed a safer crib to protect their child from the wide bars and many blankets typical of cribs of the 1940s. Skinner's newfangled crib, the baby tender, was a fully enclosed, heated and cooled crib with a viewing window. Skinner and his wife were so pleased with the creation of the crib and the great work it did, Skinner sent an article detailing the baby tender to a popular magazine at the time, Ladies' Home Journal. Ladies' Home Journal, when they published the article, renamed Skinner's crib the Baby Box, and, understandably so, many people misunderstood Skinner's intentions, believed he was experimenting on his children, and rumors of this continued to plague Skinner until his death. This, of course, was referenced among some other rumors in the video. A few years later, undeterred in 1948, Skinner published his best-known work, entitled Walden II. It's a socio-political commentary on a utopian society designed according to behaviorist principles, and to this date, the only behaviorist work to look at the socio-political society. Later on in 1948, Skinner decided to join the psychology department at Harvard University, and working with his numerous graduate students throughout the 1950s and 60s, produced several spin-off theories and 2 additional books, Science and Human Behavior, published in 1953, and The Schedules of Reinforcement, published in 1957. Skinner wasn't idle during this time period. He was still thinking about new technologies he could develop, harkening back to that pigeon project. While watching his younger daughter's math class, Skinner realized that classes in general were not set up to ask each student to perform at their individual skill level, and that oftentimes reinforcement for work well done or work poorly done was delayed. Not being able to perform at an individual skill level and delayed reinforcement, Skinner recognized as detrimental to the learning process and was determined to improve. Skinner's improvements started with the creation of teaching machines. These teaching machines were highly successful. However, they were difficult to produce, they easily broke and came out of date, and Skinner found it difficult to convince for-profit companies to produce them. So he soon abandoned that and began working on programs of instruction. These worked well in theory, however, because they were published in textbook format, oftentimes did not ensure that students were following these programs correctly, and therefore did not work to their full capacity. Finally, Skinner designed a how-to method to design sequences of steps for teaching just about anything. In fact, his sequences of steps are still being used today. Just recently, Skinner's sequence of steps were applied to teaching communication skills to autistic students. And Skinner focused on technological learning improvements as well as spin-off theories, more research books. He became concerned with a larger perspective on how behavioral science could be applied to society at large. With these concerns, Skinner decided to spend the rest of his career focused on philosophical and moral issues, hearkening back to those he first explored in his book Walden 2. Skinner published several more times about behavioral science in A Philosophy and Moral Light before passing away on August 19th, 1990. So we have finally arrived at the crux of our lesson. Should behaviorism shape educational practices? Well, B.F. Skinner will tell you, absolutely. We've learned through our knowledge of behaviorism, through our background information on B.F. Skinner, and through our class readings, that the students' motives and behaviors are shaped by their environment. Free will plays no role because free will is essentially a myth. We also learned that environmental factors affecting our students can be changed. We don't have to have our environmental factors be negative, nor do these factors have to operate without controls. And it is only through the understanding of human behavior that we can change these environmental factors. By understanding human behaviors, we, as teachers, as schools, as school districts, can replace adverse controls with positive reinforcements. This will make learning more efficient while increasing a student's motivation to learn as well. However, schools are often hesitant to do this. Why is that? Skinner points to the literature of freedom. Thanks to the literature of freedom, we as a large society have reduced the intentional controls over us, the dictatorships, etc. But the downside to this literature of freedom is that we have defined freedom as feelings, as states of mind. And as a result of this, we have now branded all forms of control as wrong. As a result of this, we cannot see the advantages of some types of control. The laws that we have in society, they are a type of control. And since they keep order in our society, that's a pretty big advantage. But because we have branded all control as wrong, we cannot see the advantage that any type of control may bring. As a result, we are now unwilling as a society to analyze the controls we have in place and change the types of controls that we expose ourselves to. Skinner would tell us that it is this unwillingness to analyze and change the types of controls we expose ourselves to. That is holding schools back from changing those adverse conditions and replacing them with positive reinforcements. It's what's stopping us from making learning more efficient while increasing a student's motivation. So should behaviorism shape educational practice? Well, according to our readings, man's struggle for freedom is not due to a will to be free, but to a certain behavioral process characteristic of the human organism. And it, meaning society, is unprepared for the next step, which is not to free men from control, but to analyze and change the kinds of control to which they are exposed. Based on this information, it sure does seem like behaviorism should shape, at least perhaps in part, our educational practices. Well, thank you for joining us for part 1 of Should Behaviorism Shape Educational Practices? Please click on part 2 for the con side of the argument. No, behaviorism should not shape educational practices.